every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Now, that is what laws of physics dictate. But that's the same when it comes to politics as well, not only restricted for the movement of objects, but it's the same in the political sphere as well. Today, to speak about the same movement and how it could have a domino effect in society, we have with us Dr. Dayan Jayatilaka joining us on Vantage Point. Thank you very much for joining us today as well. Well, just since we started off the program talking about the domino effect and how it could have an impact on society, I think it's apt to start the program with the drug trafficking record that's been taking place within the country over the past, where a Venezuelan woman was found with packets of cocaine concealed in her body, and recently a Bangladeshi national was found with heroin being concealed in his bag. So I think it's very important for us to talk about it, because the current government was elected to the position now to eradicate the drug menace. It's one of their promises. And during the previous administration, a huge fall of illicit substance was found concealed in one of the containers, and amounting to about 100 kilograms. Even though it's not to that extent, do you think that drug trafficking men should be dealt with by punitive measures, like strict punitive measures? And what measures could the government take to address this issue?
Well, yes, Stephanie, I mean, I'm not an expert on the subject, and I try not to talk about things that I don't know too much about. But I think there should be zero tolerance when it comes to drug trafficking. And I'm struck by the fact that lethal criminal activity, murders, gang-related stuff, has actually seen a spike under the new administration. Now, whatever the faults of the previous one, there was a sense that, especially under Gotabe, that the STF was being deployed to hit very hard at gangs, especially of drug traffickers, that the networks were being disrupted, that they were on the defensive, and there was a policy of zero tolerance, that basically they were being wiped out. That was the sense. There were a number of shootings of known gangsters who were drug traffickers and so on. I'm not saying they should necessarily go back to that sort of a shoot to kill policy, but there was a crackdown under the previous administration. We had gang-related activity far more manifest in the pre-Rajapaksa period, during Chandrika's tenure. And then under Rajapaksa, especially post-war, in the second term, there was a heavy-handed crackdown.
Well, that was during the war, Dr. Jayatilaka.
No, it's after the war. After the war, especially under Gotabe, I think there were a number of raids. The STF especially was used in Colombo, STF intelligence. And there were, well, quite a few lethal, quote-unquote, encounters, some of which were carried by your television station. So, the drug traffickers seem to be kind of having their backs to the wall. And gangsters as such, because there were fewer violent or lethal crimes, as far as the stats show, and that's the impression I got. Now there are too many shootings, too many killings, gang-related stuff, even in Colombo, recent shooting. That's not good, because law and order is very important. You cannot have stability and a climate of investment which will bring back young people belonging to the diaspora, the better educated people. If there isn't a sense that there's safety and security on the streets, that gangs are active again, and that's bad. That has to be stopped, and I hope somebody efficient will be given the task to do that. in a non-partisan, non-political way.
Well, there was like a heated argument last week in Parliament over the ECTA agreement between India, where Prime Minister himself said, quote, "It is unfair to criticize the horoscope of an unborn child. They will see the future of this child only after they read the horoscope once he or she is born." So he basically compared the agreement to an unborn child, whereas he was saying the future of the agreement is still unknown. We will only find out when the draft is received by the government of Sri Lanka. So does this mean that the government is really thinking about this agreement, and they've really got themselves, their heads wrapped around this whole agreement to find a solution for the employment problem that Sri Lanka currently faces?
Well, I wish the PM hadn't used that example of an unborn child, because the critics of ECTA, such as the GMOA, such as the information technology professionals, and the JVP, which was an ally of Prime Minister Wickremesinghe until recently, all say that it's not, the problem is not that there's no horoscope for an unborn child, but that rape is being committed. And they are opposed to that. So I think he used a very bad example about unborn children. So what we have here is a problem of lack of transparency and a lack of a dialogue on what the national interest really is. Now, I tend to believe people who are well educated, who are qualified. And the GMOA spokespersons seem to be extremely well educated people. Dr. Padania is a pediatric neurologist with degrees from Oxford and Texas. I tend to take such people very seriously, especially if they are bright young people and who speak well. The same is true of Dr. Nalinda Herath. Now, when these guys, and these are not rabble-rousers, when these guys analyze ECTA and say, look, do we really need Indian input into our service sector? Do we not understand that information technology is not just one sector, but it's a portal to all sectors? Everybody is networked. And if you allow that kind of external presence in your IT sector, you're really opening it up. You're opening up everything through that portal to India. I think those are very important points. So, when a government which has blamed its predecessor for being insensitive to or not reflective of the views of the better educated urban professionals in the country, when such a government is under criticism from and reacts very angrily against the most prestigious, best educated professionals in our country, it's not easy to get into medical college, then I think it's going the wrong way.
Prime Minister had assured it's going to be an exchange of goods, not services, whereas earlier it was both, and people had questions over whether it's going to be professionals who will be given in exchange of Sri Lankan professionals. So it's a matter of exchange of goods here. So how will this story really turn against the country?
How do you exchange goods in the IT sector? And why do you need a bilateral agreement with your neighbor in order to boost your IT sector? We have IT companies that are subscribed on the London Stock Exchange. Who needs the Indians in the IT sector here? Doesn't make sense to me. I mean, we had 30 years of war, despite which we have Millennium IT, we have Virtusa, we are doing well. Why do we need a deal that opens the IT sector of all things up to India, which is a huge surplus? Bangalore alone produces so many IT professionals and so on. Why do we need to do that? We'll be flooded. So it doesn't make sense to me. I mean, a country must open up those sectors in which it has a lack, not the sectors in which it is doing well. And yes, the Prime Minister has assured us, but this is the same Prime Minister who assured us that there was nothing wrong with the ceasefire agreement. And as we found out, there was quite a bit wrong with it. So I'm afraid, that's not really very convincing. If he can't convince his own former coalition partners in the National Executive Committee of January 8th, the JVP, that ECTA is okay.
So do you think the Prime Minister has
Then
a lack of confidence in the country's entrepreneurship skills? Because even in Parliament last week, when the opposition questioned as to why we had to partner up with India, with a private company of India to launch an ambulance program in Sri Lanka, the Prime Minister blatantly said that he couldn't find a single entrepreneur to start this in the local market.
I mean, that sounds ridiculous, Stephanie.
So do you think the Prime Minister has lost confidence in entrepreneurial skills in Sri Lanka?
A country that had maintained during 30 years of war a 5% growth rate and then went up to between 6 and 8 post-war has a very robust private sector. You have to assist that private sector and not allow it to be swamped by hooking up with people who are far bigger and far more powerful. So yes, I think you're right. I think Prime Minister Wickremesinghe has displayed a lack of confidence in, a lack of support for, a lack of commitment to the Sri Lankan entrepreneurial class. I'm not asking him to be a socialist, I'm asking him to be a good capitalist. But that means helping strengthen an already resilient and robust Sri Lankan business class. Why not do that? Why not find out if, as he says, there's nobody willing to do ambulance services, find out what package of incentives he has to give them. I mean, surely he should remember how President Premadasa, in whose administration he served, went about things, how he went about the garment factories program. People didn't want to invest in remote areas, but President Premadasa gave them a package of incentives and disincentives. If you don't, these are the disincentives. If you do, these are the incentives. And there came the 300 garment factories program. There is a way in which you stimulate and you facilitate the growth of the Sri Lankan private sector. But if you really don't care too much about anything Sri Lankan except that it's a brand name, then I suppose you don't go that route and you hook up with India or whoever else you can hook up with and just open up everything and allow a threat to the Sri Lankan business class and its professional class. I mean, without faith in our business class and without the support of our top professional class, I don't see how you can have a modern 21st century Sri Lanka, unless you just think of Sri Lanka as a kind of a way station or some sort of a shop where everybody comes and dumps their wares. If that's your notion of Sri Lanka, it's just a trading entrepot, it's like some, in airports you get good shops, it's just a shopping mall. Then you're okay, but that's okay. But if you care about Sri Lanka and the Sri Lankan economy, well, then you do things differently. I'm not at all surprised, Stephanie, that Fitch Ratings has downgraded Sri Lanka to minus, BB minus. I mean, this has never happened under the UNP, except under Prime Minister Wickremesinghe. The UNP is supposed to be the party of entrepreneurship. When there's a UNP government, the markets respond splendidly. I mean, if he can't understand this, I have a suggestion, and that's nothing to do with Mahinda Rajapaksa. That suggestion is, there are two people who had brilliant records of development under UNP governments. One is Mr. Ronnie DeMille, who opened up the economy under President Jawardena. he is not only alive and alert, he is in Sri Lanka most of the time. The other, on the pro-people welfare front, is Susil Sirivardhana, the senior civil servant, Oxford educated, Harvard educated, relative of President Chandrika Banaranaike Kumaratunga. He was President Premadasa's chairperson of the National Housing Development Authority and of the Jana Savya program. Now, Susil is very much alive and kicking. These are people who served UNP administrations. I do not understand why they have not been plugged in or consulted as to how to make the economy grow in an equitable way. I mean, if they were consulted, you wouldn't have pitched downgrading Sri Lanka's ratings under UNP government, and you wouldn't have farmers marching on the streets of Sri Lanka. This is ridiculous. We have the brains, we have the experience of people who serve brilliantly under UNP governments. I emphasize this, and they have been completely marginalized. I just don't get it.
And also speaking about Minister Mangala Samaravira, the foreign ministers, we should speak about his recent visit to Washington, where he had openly said that he's considering the participation of international judges and investigators for the domestic, which was earlier domestic investigation. He wants to involve, or he has expressed his willingness to involve, and said that he is considering the participation of these international actors. What have you got to say about it?
Well, yes, he did. He did. He was quoted by Reuters. He was quoted by the Associated Press. This was at the Q&A after his speech to the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. It's an important institution. They published that one of my monographs. And he said that the government has no objection to the participation of international players in an investigation into war crimes. That's how Reuters wrote the story. That was the caption. And he went on to say that foreign judges, foreign prosecutors, foreign investigators, and foreign forensic experts are all being looked at in relation to the new courts that will be set up, and that discussions are ongoing with all parties, including the TNA. He didn't mention the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, and that the new mechanism will be up and running in 5 to 6 months. Now, that's completely contrary to what the President of Sri Lanka said. One doesn't know whether Mr. Samaravira discussed this in Cabinet and the Cabinet signed off on this statement. We don't know whether he even discussed it in the United National Party, because it's the UNP, the MPs, who are going to have to go back to their constituencies at any future election and face the voters after war crimes investigations have been conducted and trials started with foreign investigators, experts, and foreign prosecutors and judges. That's not going to get them any votes. So it is important that the UNP take a stand on this, and I don't think Mr. Samaravira, if he did talk to the UNP, it's a dark secret.
So do you think this is like a battle between the political will and the laws that's within the country?
No, it's a battle between, on the one hand, the Prime Minister, Mr. Samaravira, and former President Kumaratunga, who seem to have a certain view on the subject, and on the other hand, basic common sense.
And speaking about battles, Dr. Jayatilaka, I think we should really speak about the US presidential elections.
Yep.
Some of the primaries are going on, and there's a lot of hype surrounding the Republican presidential candidate, Trump.
Yeah.
And there are even Republicans who are disowning him, saying he doesn't even represent the beliefs and values of the Republicans themselves. If Donald Trump becomes the President of the United States, what will it really mean for us Sri Lankans?
What will it mean for the world? I mean, who knows? He is erratic, he seems slightly eccentric, and he occasionally expresses extremist views. He's a maverick even within the Republican camp. And if the Republicans give him the nomination, it will mean that once again, as in 2008 and in 2011, the Republican Party is out of tune with the American people. Now, the Republican Party has got itself into a mess. That may be a mess that the British Labour Party has also got into, which is that it tends to be dominated by what its grassroots organizers say rather than what the majority of the country seems to be saying. So they lost in 2008 because of Sarah Palin. They lost in 2011 because Mitt Romney, who was less eccentric, said something very arrogant about middle class and lower middle class people. He was, too rich, catering to just the rich elite. And now they look like they've got Trump. On the Democratic side, it's far more interesting. You had a really interesting fight between Bernie Sanders, who lost the last primary, but between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. And nobody would have thought that an older man who was the mayor of Vermont, and when he was the mayor of Vermont, he called himself a socialist. He now calls himself a social democrat. That such a person could have such an effect among the American voters, but a lot of educated young people, white people, liberals, went out and voted for him because they just want some sensible, progressive changes in their country. So that's administered a shock to the Democratic frontrunner Hillary Clinton. She will have to reposition, taking into account the concerns that Bernie Sanders has flagged. I mean, I was pretty enthusiastic about Sanders, not because I thought he'd win, but because of the things he was saying. He was a breath of fresh air. Sure. So you have Bernie Sanders shaking up the Democrats, and you have Donald Trump shaking up the Republicans, but Donald Trump is Sanders is saying things that would make a lot of sense in Europe and in most parts of the world. It's social democratic pro-welfare, and it's a kind of a slightly left-of-center progressivism. Trump, on the other hand, is a real wild card. And I don't think, I may be very wrong here, but I really doubt that when push comes to shove, the American people would opt for him rather than Hillary Clinton as their leader and their representative in the world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jayathilaka, for joining us. And let's find out who will be shaking up our political sphere in the country. When you join us 2 weeks from now, you can join our conversation by following our Twitter handle Newsfirst_e, and you can post your views and what you think about the show this week. I'm Stephanie Lazarus, signing off.